Imagine a king who saw himself as a god in mortal form, a man so certain of his own destiny that he marched the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, toward a small coalition of city-states he believed would crumble under the first stomp of Persian boots. This king, Xerxes, the first of Persia, looked at Greece not as a real threat but as a tiny bump on the road to eternal glory. And why wouldn't he think that? He commanded an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. His soldiers numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He had wealth, power, and complete confidence in his own divine authority. But all that confidence meant nothing when he made the fatal mistake of underestimating 300 Spartans, a handful of Thespians and Thebans, and a narrow strip of land called Thermopylae that would turn his giant army into a useless mass of bodies waiting to be cut down. The disaster began with ego. Xerxes' belief in his own superiority was so massive that it blinded him to the basic rules of strategy. He thought numbers alone won wars. He thought size was everything. And so, he marched his men into the bottlenecked pass of Thermopylae, a coastal choke point so narrow at times that only a few soldiers could stand shoulder to shoulder. In simple terms, it was a terrible place for a giant army to fight. It was like trying to force a stadium crowd through a single doorway, while a few highly trained warriors stood waiting inside the frame. But Xerxes didn't think about that. He believed his men would roll over the Greeks simply because he told them to. As the Persian forces approached the pass, Leonidas, king of Sparta, stood with his 300 warriors as a symbol of unbreakable discipline. These men were not superhuman, but they were forged in a brutal system of lifelong military training. They were conditioned to fight, to endure pain, to hold formation, and to die if necessary without complaint. Leonidas chose them not because they were the strongest Spartans, but because they were fathers. That meant every man had already left a legacy. They were chosen to die for a purpose greater than themselves. When Xerxes looked at these 300 men, he didn't see danger. He saw arrogance. He thought the Spartans were insane. To him, they were nothing more than a tiny bump in the road. Xerxes sent a messenger, demanding that the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas famously responded with Molon Labe, "Come and take them." This was not bravado. It was a clear message. The Spartans were not leaving. They were not retreating. They were not impressed by the king who thought he controlled the world. Xerxes, annoyed and confused, assumed this was simply foolish bravado that would collapse at the first sign of real pressure. So he ordered a frontal assault. This attack marked the moment when Xerxes discovered the terrible truth of his miscalculation. When the Persian infantry charged the narrow pass, they quickly became trapped in a tight formation where their numbers meant nothing. They could not flank, they could not surround the Greeks, their spears were too short, their shields offered little protection. They were forced to fight in close quarters against men trained from childhood to stand unbroken in a phalanx formation. The Spartan shield wall held firm, absorbing the impact of wave after wave of Persian soldiers. Every time the Persians pushed, the Spartans pushed harder. Every time the Persians tried to break through, the Greeks countered with disciplined, unified force. Xerxes grew frustrated. He decided to send in his elite Immortals, his most feared and respected unit. These soldiers were named because their numbers never changed. Whenever one died, another replaced him immediately. They were trained, professional, and deadly. But even they fell to the Greek formation. They were not used to the terrain. They had no space to maneuver. The phalanx exploited every weakness. When the Immortals failed, Xerxes realized for the first time in his life that he was in real danger of losing not just men, but his reputation. This was a humiliation unfolding in front of him. The narrow pass became a slaughterhouse. Persian soldiers were pushed into the killing zone by their own comrades behind them. They slipped on the bodies of fallen men. They choked in tight clusters where they could not even lift their shields. The Spartans rotated their lines to stay fresh, pulling tired men back and replacing them with rested ones. This simple tactic, almost impossible for a less disciplined army, kept the resistance strong and relentless. Xerxes was watching his army break against a wall of bronze and discipline, and it made no sense to him. He still believed his numbers mattered. He believed his divine authority mattered, but the terrain cared nothing about his ego. The pass at Thermopylae was built for defenders. Every mistake Xerxes made fed into the Greeks' advantage, and he kept making them because he assumed their courage was temporary. He believed they would eventually falter. He assumed morale alone would break them. But the Spartans did not fear death. They expected it. They embraced it. Leonidas had told his men that they were fighting for something that would outlive them, the freedom of Greece and the example of honor. Xerxes kept ordering waves of attacks, hoping to wear down the Greeks through sheer persistence. But persistence means nothing against an entrenched, disciplined force with nowhere to retreat and no desire to surrender. By the second day, the Persian army had already taken devastating casualties. The myth that numbers win battles shattered. Xerxes couldn't understand why a small army was standing firm while his massive force was stumbling and dying in droves. Imagine watching tens of thousands of your own men thrown again and again into a narrow funnel where they had no space to fight. Imagine realizing that you, the king who believed he ruled by divine right, had walked your army into a trap, visible even to amateurs. That was Xerxes' reality, but instead of adapting, he kept pushing forward with the belief that sheer pressure would eventually crush the Greeks. It never occurred to him that he was the one crushing his own men with his bad decisions. Thermopylae turned into a symbol of his weakness rather than his strength. His massive army had no room to operate. His elite soldiers failed. His pride made him impatient. Leonidas, on the other hand, understood exactly what he was doing. The ground was part of his army. The narrow pass itself became a weapon. Every decision he made fed directly into the strengths of the Greek forces. He wasn't being reckless. He wasn't being emotional. He was applying centuries of Spartan doctrine to the perfect battlefield. The result was a lesson locked in history. Arrogance can destroy even the largest empire. Xerxes entered Greece, believing no one could stop him, but a narrow pass and 300 disciplined warriors shattered that illusion. His underestimation of both the terrain and the men defending it created one of the most iconic last stands in military history. Xerxes may have had the biggest army, but Leonidas had the better plan, the stronger discipline, and the iron resolve that Persia could not break. This was only the beginning of the story, but it sets the stage for everything that followed the betrayal, the sacrifice, and the immortal legacy of the 300. Xerxes thought he was about to record the greatest victory of his reign. Instead, he walked straight into a historical disaster that would haunt Persian strategy for generations. If you want to keep digging through history's dumbest decisions, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The moment Xerxes pushed the full weight of his army toward the narrow pass at Thermopylae, he believed he was marching toward a simple, clean victory. He thought that the Greeks would either scatter at the sight of his numbers or collapse under the pressure of a sustained push. But the pass was not a normal battlefield, and the Greeks were not standing there by accident. The Greek commanders, especially the Spartans under Leonidas, understood something that many generals throughout history forget. Terrain can be a weapon. A narrow pass can turn a tiny force into a wall of iron. It can turn 1,000,000 men into a confused crowd. When used right, it becomes a trap that snaps shut before the enemy understands what is happening. Thermopylae was exactly that kind of trap. The Greeks studied the pass and recognized its natural design. The sea pressed one side of the battlefield, and steep cliffs pressed the other. The actual fighting ground shrank to the width of a modern two-lane road. Only a handful of men could stand shoulder to shoulder in that space. It meant that the Persians could only attack in small waves. The Greeks took advantage of this with discipline, armor, and a system of rotation that kept their front line fresh. Leonidas did not need thousands. He needed men who understood that holding a line in a choke point was not about speed or flair. It was about discipline, shield placement, and teamwork. Picture the Persian army trying to pour into this narrow cut in the land. It was like watching someone try to shove a lake through a straw. Their numbers worked against them. Their formations broke down the moment they entered the pass. The elite Immortals, the units Xerxes believed, were unstoppable, found themselves stuck behind other soldiers, with no room to maneuver. Their archers had no clear shot. Their cavalry was useless. Their mass became a slow-moving column of men who entered in small batches, only to slam face-first into a bronze wall. The Greek phalanx was simple, but in the right terrain, it became terrifying. Heavy bronze shields overlapped, spears thrust forward in a tight pattern. Each man relied on his neighbor to hold the formation. The Greek shields locked into each other and formed a barrier that the Persians could not break. When the front rank tired, new men stepped forward from behind. This rotation kept the wall intact, while the Persian waves grew weaker with each failed attack. The Greeks did not sprint. They did not break formation. They fought like a machine that breathed, stepped, and struck as one unit. A Persian soldier entering that space would see a row of bronze helmets, the dark shadows of spear points, and the unbroken line of shields. He had no space to swing a sword with strength. He had no room to dodge. He pushed forward because there were men behind him pushing him on, but the pressure only crushed the front ranks against the Greek line. The Spartans and their allies used this pressure to drive spears into the crowded mass. Every thrust found a target because there was nowhere for the Persians to go. This is what Xerxes did not understand. He assumed that numbers always win, but the Greeks turned his numbers into a weakness. They knew that a narrow pass was the perfect counter to a vast army that relied on mobility and open terrain. They forced the Persians to fight on Greek terms. They did not match the Persians with exotic tactics or tricky maneuvers. They simply used the pass to choke the enemy and force them into a slow, grinding fight that the Greeks were built to win. Imagine a Persian officer trying to shout orders in the chaos. He could not see the full battlefield. He could not see where his men were dying. He could not reposition troops because the landscape did not allow it. He could not bring fresh units forward fast enough because the entrance to the pass fit only a few men at a time. The more he pushed, the more the formation collapsed. It was a disaster, shaped by geography and amplified by the rigid discipline of the Greeks. Greek armor also played a major role. The hoplites wore bronze cuirasses, greaves, and helmets. They carried heavy shields and long spears. Their armor could absorb blows that would kill a lighter soldier. The Persians, by contrast, wore linen or light leather armor. It was fine for fast movement in open battles, but useless in the crush of a tight pass. When a Greek spear struck, it pierced. When a Persian spear struck, it either bounced or slipped off a shield. Over time, this difference shaped the rhythm of the fight. Each clash favored the Greeks because they could take a hit and give back a stronger one. Many stories describe moments during the battle when the Persians believed they were close to breaking the Greek line. They saw the tightly packed phalanx slowing under the weight of constant fighting. They saw sweat dripping through the eye holes of the helmets. Then the Greeks' rotated fresh men stepped forward, and the front rank retreated to rest. This simple, practical method shocked the Persians. They did not expect an exhausted enemy to suddenly regain strength without pulling back. They believed they had gained ground, only to find the wall renewed. Think about how this must have looked to a Persian soldier. He expected a tired enemy gasping for breath. Instead, he saw new shields lock into place, new spears thrust forward, and the same disciplined wall refusing to collapse. It felt like fighting a force that never weakened. This psychological blow was as powerful as the physical one. Xerxes' pride took hit after hit as he watched his elite units stumble backwards from men he expected to crush in minutes. The Greek commanders also used the geography to cut off Persian movement. A narrow pass removes the concept of flanking. You cannot circle around someone when you can barely stand beside them. A Persian officer could not instruct his men to swing left or right. He could only tell them to push forward. That kept the battle simple for the Greeks. Hold the line. Keep the shields up. Let the terrain remove half the options the Persians normally used. If Xerxes had chosen an open field, his cavalry and archers would have burned through the Greek ranks. He could have enveloped them from both sides. He could have used speed, shock, and mass. But he took his army into a natural bottleneck. It was the worst possible place to use numerical superiority. The Greeks saw this and seized the advantage with perfect timing. Another overlooked part of the Greek plan was morale. Greek soldiers fighting for their cities believed the pass was their last line of defense. They saw themselves as the shield protecting Greece. They stood there not only with weapons, but with conviction. The Persians fought because they were ordered to. The difference in motivation sharpened the Greek resistance. In a narrow pass, morale weighs heavily because once you step into the killing ground, there is no space to retreat without causing panic. The Greeks needed to stand. They stood. Every hour that passed in this trap drained Persian strength. They lost not just men, but confidence. They realized the fight was not a normal battle. It was a grinding slaughter against a force that had mastered both terrain and formation. The Persians had walked into a perfect defensive design. Xerxes believed he could use fear to break Greek resolve. But he discovered that fear worked both ways. The sight of Persian soldiers piling up in the pass, unable to move or fight freely, sent a message to both sides. To the Greeks, it proved their strategy worked. To the Persians, It showed that size alone means nothing when the battlefield is a narrow throat carved into the earth. Thermopylae was not a fair fight. It was a trap built from stone, sea, and Spartan discipline. And the Persians stepped right into it without understanding the cost they were about to pay. Xerxes watched the first engagements with a level of confidence that made perfect sense to him and absolutely no sense to anyone who understood the terrain. He believed he could break the Greek line through simple force. He believed that numbers were a universal answer. He believed that sending in the first waves of Medes and Scythians would overwhelm the Spartans through sheer volume. What he did not understand on what his advisors likely feared telling him was that he was sending units built for open field movement into a stone corridor that punished every weakness in their training. The waves he threw forward did not form a strategy. They formed a waste of life that proved how little he understood the battlefield. The Medes and the Scythians were not incompetent. They were loyal troops from within the empire, trained for regular infantry work, but they were not elites. They relied on momentum, space, and numbers. Their armor was light, their shields were small, their spears were short. None of these traits mattered in normal conditions, but in a narrow pass, every flaw grew larger. They stepped into the choke point and found themselves crushed together, unable to swing their weapons with force. Their shields overlapped poorly. Their spears could not reach beyond the Greek line. They walked forward because Xerxes ordered them to, but the moment they reached the Greek wall, they met a stable. Well-drilled phalanx that simply absorbed the impact, pushed back with precision, and killed them in controlled, efficient motions. Imagine being in that front wave. You see a row of bronze shields forming a wall. You see only a few feet of open ground. You try to thrust your spear, but the angle is bad due to the crowd behind you pushing for space. When you try to swing your sword, you find your arm blocked by the men next to you. You cannot step back, you cannot duck, you cannot shift your footing. Behind you, more soldiers clog the space, desperate to move forward because they do not want to disobey. Ahead of you, spear points rest steady, waiting for the exact moment to strike. You are not fighting an enemy who rushes at you. You are fighting a wall, and you are fighting it while pinned in place. Xerxes did not notice the problems because he did not believe a few hundred men could hold against thousands. He saw the battle as a matter of pressure. Keep pressing forward until the line breaks. But the Greeks were not fighting a normal defensive action. They were using the landscape to force a static fight on terms that favored them in every category except raw numbers. The more Xerxes pushed, the more those numbers turned into bottlenecked rows of men who died without swinging a weapon. When the Medes failed, Xerxes did not question the approach. He did not rethink the strategy. He simply escalated the pressure. He believed the Medes had lacked the will. He believed the Scythians had lacked the strength. He believed that persistence would break the line eventually. So he ordered the next wave forward, then the next, then another. Each of these units stepped into the same tight ground, formed the same jammed cluster, and died under the same disciplined spear points. The Greek rotation system added even more damage to this mistake. The Spartans fought in cycles. Every time a front rank hoplite grew tired, another took his place. The Persians saw no weakness. They only saw an enemy that kept hitting them with fresh strength, while their own waves withered under exhaustion and confusion. A competent commander would have paused. He would have noticed that the narrow terrain forced his men to attack in files rather than ranks. He would have realized that the Greek use of armor, heavy shields, and long spears made the fight static and favored defense. He would have understood that sending large numbers into a narrow pass does not create overwhelming power. It creates a traffic jam that kills morale and blunts every attack. But Xerxes was not willing to accept that his first approach could fail. He believed that adjusting his plan would signal weakness. In his mind, a king sent orders, and the world bent to his will. The idea that a small Greek force could force him to reconsider was unthinkable. The most damaging part of his arrogance was not the number of waves he sent. It was the way he sent them. He offered no variation. He did not try staggered attacks. He did not test the flanks for hidden paths early on. He did not use archers in coordination with infantry pushes. He did not try coordinated timing. He simply threw bodies at the problem, and every time the problem killed those bodies, he acted as though the solution was to throw more. Picture his command tent, overlooking the field. Messengers run in with reports of heavy losses. Xerxes waves them off and orders more men forward. He sees the Greek line holding, but believes that the next push will do it. He sees his men die, but believes they die because they lack commitment, not because they are trapped by geography and forced into conditions that make their training useless. This is the core of the folly. He was a king who interpreted every setback as disobedience or weakness, never as a natural consequence of his own choices. While the Medes and Scythians were crushed, the Greeks gained something just as valuable as the physical advantage. Rhythm. They controlled the pace of the battle. They knew exactly when the next wave would come because Xerxes changed nothing. They used that predictable pace to keep their rotation in sync. The Spartans in the front fought until they reached the point of fatigue where precision slipped. Then they stepped back through the ranks, and another hoplite stepped up with a full reserve of strength. This system allowed the Greeks to maintain a constant level of efficiency, while the Persians experienced increasing exhaustion with each failed wave. The psychological effect made the error even worse. Persian troops entered the pass expecting a victory. When they saw their comrades fall in heaps while the Greek line held steady, fear spread. Soldiers whispered that the Greeks were too strong, that the wall was unbreakable, that the terrain cursed them. These rumors grew because Xerxes did not offer an explanation or a new tactic. He only ordered more attacks. When a leader responds to losses with stubborn repetition, troops lose faith. When troops lose faith, discipline breaks. When discipline breaks, the army becomes a mass rather than a unit. The Greeks sensed this shift. They heard the panic. They saw hesitation in the Persian steps. They watched soldiers approach with fear rather than purpose. These details allowed the Greeks to press at key moments, killing more men with less risk. In a narrow pass, when momentum breaks on the attacking side, the defenders gain an enormous advantage. They do not need to chase, they only need to hold. Xerxes' refusal to adapt went beyond stubbornness. It showed a misunderstanding of his own army. The Medes and Scythians were not shock troops. They were not trained for prolonged frontal assaults in confined terrain. They were meant to support larger operations in open fields, where their mobility mattered. In the narrow pass, every trait that made them reliable infantry turned against them. Light armor became exposure. Short spears became liabilities. Loose formations became chaos. Xerxes treated them as though they were interchangeable with heavy infantry, which they were not. For the Greeks, this error was a gift. They faced units that could not threaten the phalanx. They fought enemies who had no plan beyond pushing forward. They saw waves that lacked coordination. They met every attack with the same steady response. It was not a clash of strategy, it was a clash of discipline against arrogance. And at Thermopylae, arrogance broke first. Even after it became clear that the Greek line was not cracking, Xerxes refused to consider any tactic beyond throwing more men forward. He kept insisting that the Spartans were near collapse. He convinced himself that one more push would break them. This thinking turned the battle into a cycle of predictable failure, each one costing thousands of lives for no gain. His own officers understood the waste, but few dared to speak against him. In a monarchy built on absolute authority, challenging the king's judgment carried more danger than the battlefield. As daylight burned and the bodies piled, Xerxes finally realized the failure of his first plan. But by that point, he had already sacrificed countless soldiers in attacks that had no chance of success. The Spartans did not beat him through genius alone. They beat him because he refused to think. They beat him because he treated the battlefield as a place where willpower replaced strategy. They beat him because he turned his numerical advantage into nothing, more than a long line of victims entering a narrow road with one exit. Xerxes did not break the Greek line through force. He broke it through the fragile and predictable parts of human nature. It took only one man with the right amount of greed and fear to undo the entire defensive advantage that Leonidas had built. That man was Ephialtes, a Greek, familiar with the mountains around Thermopylae. He carried no loyalty to the Spartans, no sense of duty to the Greek alliance, and no interest in anything beyond personal gain. He approached the Persian camp convinced that the winning side would be the one with the largest army. In his mind, selling information to a king with a massive force was not betrayal. It was good timing. The Persians had failed again and again to break the narrow pass. Xerxes saw his soldiers crushed by the Greek phalanx. He saw the Greeks rotate fresh warriors into the line. He heard reports of elite Persian units failing to advance even a few feet. His frustration built with each hour. He wanted the pass open. He wanted a quick end to the stalemate. He wanted victory to come from one clear, decisive order. When Ephialtes arrived with an offer to reveal a hidden path behind the Greek position, Xerxes did not hesitate. He did not check the claim. He did not ask his generals for analysis. He simply accepted the offer because it matched the result he wanted. It matched his impatience. The path Ephialtes described ran along the mountains above Thermopylae. Local shepherds and hunters had used it for generations to cross the ridge. It was narrow, rugged, and steep, but it allowed anyone who knew it to bypass the main pass and emerge behind it. The Greeks knew of this path and had posted a small force of Phocians there to guard it. They believed it secure, but that belief depended on the assumption that no Greek would betray the Allied defense. That assumption failed the moment gold entered the conversation. Xerxes sent the Immortals to follow Ephialtes. The Immortals were his elite infantry, heavily trained, tightly disciplined, and used for decisive maneuvers. They were the unit he brought when he wanted something done with certainty. They moved silently up the path, climbing through thick forest and rocky slopes, while Ephialtes led them step by step. The Immortals were not slowed by terrain. They were not distracted by the height or the narrow footing. They only focused on reaching the point behind the Greek line. Imagine standing guard on that ridge as a Phocian sentry. You watch the weather, you listen to the wind. You expect scouts or stray animals. You do not expect a betrayal from your own people. When you hear the movement of branches, you think it is wildlife. When you see shapes through the trees, you assume they belong to Allied scouts. But then an entire column steps through the foliage. They move with an order that tells you they are professionals. Their armor glints, their faces show intent. At that moment, the Phocians had to choose between fighting a larger, better-equipped force in rough terrain or retreating to warn Leonidas. They tried to hold the ridge, but the surprise was too great. The Immortals forced them back with pressure, not speed. Once the Phocians fell into disorder, the Immortals continued down the trail toward the main pass. The betrayal changed the Greek situation in an instant. Leonidas received the news that the enemy had flanked the position. He understood what it meant before the messenger even finished speaking. The narrow pass no longer protected his men. The defensive plan depended entirely on the Persians being blocked at the front. Once the enemy reached the rear, the entire defensive advantage vanished. The Greeks would be trapped between two forces. They could stay together and be surrounded, or they could retreat and give up the pass. Neither option offered victory. One offered survival for many. The other offered a final stand. The betrayal had not broken the Greek resolve. It had broken the geometry of the battlefield. Leonidas had prepared for a direct assault. He had not prepared for a hidden approach revealing itself through treachery. He gathered the Greek leaders and explained the situation plainly. Only a small force could remain to delay the Persians. The rest needed to withdraw and regroup with the main Greek army. Some would stay, some would leave. The decision was not a sign of weakness. It was a direct response to how the battlefield had changed. Xerxes believed that Ephialtes had delivered a simple solution. He believed that the path was the key to a clean victory. But the betrayal did something else. It forced the Spartans and their allies into a position where they would not retreat easily. Leonidas kept a core of Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans to fight to the last man. They stayed not because victory was possible, but because holding the Persians for even a short time created space for the Greek cities to prepare for the next battles. Ephialtes did not buy a Persian victory. He bought a longer, bloodier fight. When the Immortals emerged behind the Greek line, they expected panic. They expected collapse. Instead, they saw a wall of shields turn to face them. The Spartans did not run. They adjusted their formation and prepared to fight in both directions. This forced the Persians to engage in a confined area again, even with the flank advantage. Leonidas and his men fought with the clarity of soldiers, who knew they were not fighting for survival, but for delay. They controlled their fear. They focused on the time they needed to buy. Each minute they held increased the Greek chances of stopping the Persians later. Xerxes observed the final stand and believed it confirmed the need for the betrayal. He saw the Greeks trapped. He saw the two-way pressure. He saw the defenders cut off. But he still did not understand what he was seeing. He saw bodies fall. He saw shields break. He saw the last Spartans fight past exhaustion. What he did not notice was the cost of reaching that position. The betrayal solved the pass, but it did not solve the real problem. The Greeks now had an example of resistance that would echo beyond the last spear thrust. The decision to trust Ephialtes revealed the limits of Xerxes' mind. He wanted quick answers. He believed shortcuts fixed problems rather than shifted them. He placed more confidence in a random informant than in his own commanders. He never questioned why Ephialtes was willing to sell his own people. He never considered that a man willing to betray one group for gold might betray another if the terms changed. Xerxes never thought about character. He only thought about leverage. Even after the Immortals completed their flanking maneuver, Xerxes still relied on the idea that numbers and position would give him a final, total victory. He believed the betrayal had broken Greek strength, but betrayal only breaks formations. It does not break spirit. The last Greek fighters proved this when they fought on open ground after their spears shattered. They fought with short swords, they fought through wounds, they fought until they were crushed beneath the final Persian push. Ephialtes did not receive the wealth he dreamed of. He did not become important. He did not change the course of the war. He only ensured that his name became tied to treachery forever. In Greek culture, his name became a warning. It was used to describe betrayal so deep that it damaged an entire cause. Xerxes did not understand the long-term cost of relying on a traitor. A field won through betrayal can still be lost in the next battle. The Greeks lost the pass, but they gained a symbol. They gained a story. They gained proof that courage could survive even when strategy failed. The Persians gained nothing that would endure. Xerxes' army finally overwhelmed the Greeks at Thermopylae, but the victory was hollow. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with a few hundred allies, fought knowing that death was certain. Every man who held his shield, who tightened his grip on his spear, who rotated through the front line, understood the cost. They were not defending for glory alone. They were defending to give the rest of Greece time to prepare. They understood that the ultimate goal was not the pass itself, but the survival of the larger Greek resistance. Their stand was a carefully chosen sacrifice, the kind of choice that few armies in history have executed with such clarity. The Persians poured through the pass. The Immortals and other elite units smashed against the remaining lines. The Spartans fought with precision, closing ranks when gaps appeared, driving off waves of attackers and refusing to yield ground except when forced. They inflicted casualties far beyond what any standard expectation would allow, using terrain, formation, and sheer discipline to make their inevitable defeat as costly as possible for the enemy. Every fallen Greek soldier added time for the evacuation and regrouping of the main Greek forces. Every resisted advance by Xerxes' army slowed his march and gave room for strategy to emerge elsewhere. Even after their shields were shattered and their spears broken, the Spartans pressed the fight. They shifted from long spears to short swords, from formation combat to hand-to-hand struggles. When their armor failed, they relied on skill, strength, and sheer determination. This final act was not reckless bravery. It was methodical, conscious, and purposeful. Leonidas understood that a visible, heroic stand would inspire the rest of Greece. Even in death, these men were instruments of strategy, extending influence beyond their immediate battlefield. The effect of their sacrifice went beyond the tactical news of their stand, traveled across the Greek city-states, carried by messengers, and whispered by survivors. The image of a few hundred men holding off Xerxes' massive army ignited courage and unity in otherwise fragmented regions. City-states that had been hesitant to resist Persian rule now found a symbol of defiance they could rally behind. Leonidas' stand became a narrative of moral strength triumphing over overwhelming force. The story reached sailors, hoplites, and citizens, telling them that the Persian army was not invincible. It told them that commitment, discipline, and courage could resist even the largest empire. From a strategic perspective, the sacrifice achieved what any conventional victory could not have. While the Spartans and their allies fell, the main Greek armies were not crushed. They regrouped, planned, and eventually executed coordinated strategies that included naval dominance at Salamis and land engagements at Plataea. Thermopylae became a keystone event, a moment where calculated loss directly facilitated future victories. Leonidas and his men transformed a battlefield defeat into a long-lasting tactical advantage. The Persians had gained territory, but not momentum. They had won the pass, but lost the narrative. The legend of the Spartans became a rallying cry. a psychological blow far more enduring than a simple military conquest. Xerxes may have believed that overwhelming force and betrayal would crush Greek resistance. He underestimated the power of morale, honor, and narrative. The Spartans' death demonstrated that warfare is not just about numbers and weapons, it is about perception, influence, and the psychological reach of actions. Every Spartan who fell became part of an enduring lesson. Courage can shape events far beyond the moment of combat. The narrative of Thermopylae would echo for centuries, shaping not just Greek identity, but the wider understanding of heroism, resistance, and the power of sacrifice against impossible odds. This final stand illustrates a key principle of history often overlooked by generals. Tangible victory is not the only measure of success. Moral influence, inspiration, and the ability to shape the enemy's perception are forces as powerful as any sword or spear. Leonidas' decision to hold the pass exemplified how conscious sacrifice can turn tactical defeat into strategic victory. The Greeks may have lost the ground, but they gained time, unity, and the moral high ground. Xerxes may have won the battle, but the story of the 300 Spartans ensured that he would never truly claim the triumph of Greece. Thermopylae became more than a military engagement. It became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of the limits of arrogance, the value of preparation, and the potency of selfless action. It taught that one can convert inevitable loss into enduring gain when every choice is deliberate and aligned with a larger purpose. The Spartans understood the calculus of sacrifice, that to preserve the many, a few must stand, even against impossible odds. This understanding has inspired military strategists, historians, and storytellers for generations, demonstrating that courage, discipline, and selfless action can outlast empires. In the end, the story of Thermopylae is about transformation. It is about converting raw bravery into lasting influence. The Spartans' death did not merely slow Xerxes' advance, it altered the entire trajectory of the Persian campaign in Greece. By forcing the Greeks to mobilize and consolidate their forces, the 300 Spartans ensured that subsequent battles could be fought under favorable conditions. Xerxes' army advanced, yes, but the Greek coalition survived, learned, and eventually prevailed. The tactical setback of Thermopylae became the moral foundation for a strategic triumph that no amount of Persian wealth, size, or arrogance could undo. Every shield raised, every spear thrust, every calculated step into near-certain death served a purpose far beyond the individual. Leonidas and his men did not die in vain. They executed a principle of warfare that few understand. The real value of a soldier lies not just in what he kills, but in what his action enables for others. Their stand created space, time, and inspiration. The Persians took the pass, but the spirit of Thermopylae remained unassailable. Even centuries later, armies study this event not for the tactics alone, but for the psychological, cultural, and moral dimensions of a true, purposeful sacrifice. The legacy of the 300 Spartans illustrates that human courage can redirect the course of history. It shows that even when numerical odds are overwhelmingly against you, disciplined, focused, and deliberate action can create consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. Xerxes underestimated the power of narrative, the effect of morale, and the importance of principle. The Greeks, though fewer in number, leveraged their discipline and commitment into a force multiplier of influence, demonstrating that even in defeat, one can achieve lasting victory.